It was the most popular book of the medieval age, next to the Bible. But it's actually a summing up of the ideas of the classical age in Neoplatonic Christian form. Now, if you don't know what Neoplatonism is, don't worry about it. Ignatius really sees himself as something of a modern day Boethius. He's a man whose thought represents the culmination of the glories of the past. And here's where the picaresque element comes in. He sees himself living in corrupt times. Okay, so Ignatius is always repetitively referring to throughout the book just to geometry, theology, the wheel of fortuna spinning upwards and downwards, the as his luck changes, the need for order and hierarchy, the idea that we should all just be satisfied with our lot in life and not strive for anything or engage in ambitious social climbing, etc. All of these ideas are in accords with the rigid monarchical feudal system. Okay, and interestingly, he also has a delusional persecution mania that actually parallels the very real persecution of Boethius. So that's Boethius. That's the consolation of philosophy. Now we have to talk about this other book, that another medieval book that's also referenced in Dunces, but in a more subtextual, in a more under the surface way, and that's Piers Plowman. Okay, now Piers Plowman is a Middle English poem that may possibly have been written by a guy named William Langland, a contemporary of Geoffrey Chaucer, but that's kind of speculative. In the beginning of this poem, the main character, he has a vision of a fair field of folk where every social class is described, and each character is described kind of satirically and stereotypically. And after the main character has his vision, he's appointed to lead all of these social types on to on a quest, on this quest of liberation to see the truth. Okay, so that's pretty much what Ignatius sees himself as doing. So later in the novel, he starts writing his Journal of a Working Boy, where he just chronicles his deeds and ideals. And this journal is a parody, in essence and narrative style, of Piers Plowman. So Piers Plowman is basically transposed into modern day New Orleans. And so Ignatius is on this quest. He's trying to confront them with his worldview. And there's a sense in which Ignatius, he really sees each of these people he comes across as degenerates who need saving, and to this extent he's foisting his own worldview upon them, right? But actually, each character isn't too far away from being the way he thinks they are. They're pretty materialistic. They're one-dimensional. Almost without exception, they're social types who are incredibly stupid in some way or another, and each has his one particular obsession and is just repetitively described as just doing the same things. As an example, let's take Ignatius' view on African Americans. This is on page 134 in my edition. In a sense, I have always felt something of a kinship. I've always felt something of a kinship with the colored race, because its position is the same as mine. We both exist outside the inner realm of American society. Of course, my exile is voluntary. However, it is apparent that many of the Negroes wish to become active members of the American middle class, so I cannot imagine why. I must admit that this desire on their part leads me to question their value judgments. However, if they wish to join the bourgeoisie, it is really none of my business. They may seal their own doom. Personally, I would agitate quite adamantly if I suspected that anyone were attempting to help me upward towards the middle class. I was trying to do the voice of the character in the audiobook. I do that rather poorly. But anyway, so we have a satirical take on African American values in the late 1960s that's largely unwitting on Ignatius' part and just reflects his own stereotypes. But now let's focus on the character of Jones. Now, Jones is probably the most significant character in the novel after Ignatius' girlfriend, or Ignatius and his girlfriend, Myrna Minkoff, who I'm not going to talk about. I'm only going to talk about the character of Jones. So Jones, he's an illiterate African American who works for the villain of the novel, who's this oppressive boss who works in a sleazy strip club, and so Jones works for little pay. In some sense, he's the least one-dimensional character. in the novel after Ignatius because he's something of a parallel to Ignatius himself. He recognizes the hypocrisy of the society he lives in and his own outsider status. And he possesses a level of self-awareness that everyone else lacks, Ignatius included. Now, he's one of the only characters without a consciousness who isn't just entirely atrophied here. Okay, but he's also, in another sense, just very mechanical. He's something of a variant, actually, on the scheming servant type that's found in historical comedies. The scheming servant. He's very instrumental to the plot in resourcefully foiling his boss. He's always repetitively described as doing some kind of manual janitorial work. He's always wearing dark sunglasses and surrounded by opaque clouds of cigarette smoke. Moreover, he's always complaining about his job. I mean, rightfully so, maybe. He's always talking about money. He's always dreaming of something better. And just to take an example here, this is on page 143 of my edition. Let me see. I tire of being caught in a trap paying me $20 a week. Working with a bird as big as an eagle. I want to get someplace, man. Whoa! I want me an air condition, some color TV, sit around drinking something better than beer. And then later on, he meets Ignatius. Jones and Ignatius meet, they converse, and they have a little confrontation of values. And so Jones here says, how come a white cat like you, talking so good, selling weenies? You must be out of your mind, man. You ought to have a good job, big Buick, all that. Whoa! Air conditioned, color TV. I have a very pleasant occupation, Ignatius answered icily. Outdoor work, no supervision. The only pressure is on the feet. If I go to college, I wouldn't be dragging no meat wagon around selling people a lot of garbage. And this goes on. And then, hey, listen. What do you think a color cat can do to stop being vagrant or employed below the minimum wage? Please. Ignatius fumbled through his smock to find the curb and raise himself. You can't possibly realize how confused you are. Your value judgments are all wrong. When you get to the top or wherever it is that you want to go, you'll have a nervous breakdown, or worse. Do you know of any Negroes with ulcers? Of course not. Live contentedly in some hovel. Thank Fortuna that you have no Caucasian parents hounding you. Read Boethius. Okay, so we can see that actually, really in a lot of ways, Jones is actually something of the person that Ignatius sees him as being, if not entirely. And most of the other characters are as well, and a lot more so. Now, we have to go on a brief digression and talk about the history of comedy. Now, for most of history, comedy deals in stereotypes, and there are a few exceptions. Don Quixote, Falstaff, Jonathan Swift aren't stereotypical, but most of the time it's just stereotypes. So it involves a feature where a character just is exaggerated. He has some feature that is exaggerated to the point where that feature just dominates that character. Okay, so look at Aristophanes. Aristophanes took Socrates and turned him into a pedant in his play The Clouds. And then in Roman comedy, you have these characters emerging like the tricky slave, or the buffoon, and the Miles Gloriosus, the boastful soldier. And so there's that, and then there's Moliere. Now Moliere is the supreme example of this. He's one of the funniest writers who ever lived. He's a supreme example of this just use of stock characters. But then in the mid-20th century, you have a shift, and instead of stereotyped characters, quirkiness starts to come to the fore. And I think this really starts with Samuel Beckett. You have characters that do and say just really weird things. The humor lies in that bizarreness. And it's just strange for the sake of being strange. So a lot of movies today are like this. It involves this kind of humor. Maybe even most of them. I don't know. Little Miss Sunshine, if you've seen that, Little Miss Sunshine is one of the more high-quality examples of this. So that is a brief and no doubt oversimplified history of comedy. And so why did I talk about that? Well, I'll tie that in a second. But before I do, I want to say that in most comic stories, the main character is totally normal, totally uninteresting, who just offsets the obsessions of the comedic characters. He just acts as a moral foil for them. He resolves the conflict. He gets the girl, and etc. Whatever. And he tends to be just really boring. He's really one-dimensional. He's not an interesting character. It's the other characters who are interesting. But in this book, that's not the case. The singular obsessions of the minor characters play off against Ignatius. And they show on one level the absurdity of Ignatius' own worldview, but then they also show the pitfalls of their own simple-minded and stereotypical worldviews. And so we're both laughing at Ignatius and laughing with him. And that's the genius of John Kennedy Toole. Because he really belongs in a class with Cervantes and with Shakespeare, or at least with Shakespeare's comedic plays. He simultaneously celebrates what he lampoons. Okay?